episode, but not only another episode, but season 2 of Artisteada, which I am extremely happy about, as I was in every single episode of last season, but with new conversations, new very exciting conversations. And today we are here with an icon, an award-winning journalist, host, producer, who actually had the very first hip-hop channel on YouTube, congrats, called Hard Knock TV. Also created the very first Latinx series called Scene for the TV Academy. And most recently, showran, created, and hosted the series De La Calle for MTV and Paramount Plus. Welcome, Nick Barili. We are so excited to have you.
Thank you for having me. I feel like I'm home with a couch. It's cool. It's a good vibe.
Well, I love that you're loving the vibes. To be honest, I feel like there is some sort of like pressure because I'm like, man, like I am interviewing the master interviewer.
I'm more comfortable in your seat than I am on this seat.
Oh.
So I'm like, wait, I gotta answer questions now. I'm like, all right, this is different.
Okay, well,
we're changing hats.
Yeah, and I'm actually excited because I was like, you know what? I'm going to ask for feedback so that the rest of the season, improves. But let's start with your life when you came to the United States. You are from Argentina. You came here at 9 years old.
I did.
And first of all, why did you migrate to the United States?
I moved to the U.S. with my mom because my mom got a Fulbright scholarship to UC Berkeley School of Journalism. So she was working at a newspaper in Buenos Aires. I actually grew up with my grandparents first, and then I lived with my mom for a couple of years, and then we moved here. But we really moved for her to chase her dreams. She wanted to be a foreign correspondent. She had interviewed a famous Argentinian author named Borges, and that interview had ran in the New York Times, and that gave her the idea of like wanting to be a foreign correspondent. So yeah, she came to the school of journalism in Berkeley, and I came with her. I didn't speak any English. I went to Malcolm X Elementary School in the first couple of years. I was just like not understanding what was going on, but it was hip hop and sports were the one thing where I didn't really need to understand the language. I understood the vibe, and that kind of allowed me to start to figure out what it was like. Because it's very different cultures on a lot of levels. I think growing up in Latin America, at least for me, like when you meet someone, you like hug them and give them a kiss, whether it's a man or a woman or whatever. Like we like give a kiss in the cheeks. And then as a little kid, I came to do that, and people were like, "Whoa, like slow down! Like what are you doing?" And I'm like, "What?" Like I didn't understand that I was in a different culture. Like it took me a while to register that. So I actually became really introverted from not speaking the language and also not understanding the social codes of how people here move different.
Yeah,
So,
just recently that happened to me, and I was very embarrassed because every once in a while it happens to me, like maybe once a year, that I am interacting with someone, and when I leave, my brain just automatically like kisses people.
Yeah.
And I was so embarrassed because I'm like, I'm sure she wasn't expecting this, but I'm sure like I wasn't expecting this either. So it's very random. But I would love to talk about like when you came here. I also came here to the United States the first time, because I moved a million times, but the first time when I was 9 years old.
okay. Did you speak English?
I did not.
Okay.
And what was interesting about this was that they put me, it was like in the border. So there were dual language classes, and they put me in the Spanish speaking one. But I honestly don't know if my mom knew we weren't going to be here for a long time, that she was like, you're not learning English, so let's put you in the English only classes. So I was forced to have a similar experience to you, in which I did not know anything, any English, and out of survival, I had to like learn within the first 3 months. But how was that for you? Were you in like dual language classes, or was it completely English?
It was completely English. They had something called ESL, but it wasn't just for kids who spoke Spanish. It was like the kids who spoke Chinese, kids who like, there was Muslim kids. There was all kinds of like different kids, and they would pull all of us from class and take us to one room. But we all speak all different languages, so they're talking to us like, hello, today. And I'm like, what? Like, what are we doing like right now? How are you going to communicate with like people who speak like 10 different languages? So I actually hated ESL because I already felt like I didn't belong. And that moment, whenever it was third period, fourth period, where they would be like, you all leave, it made us feel even more like we didn't belong, because it was like, oh, all the foreign kids you get to go sit in a room and, you know, try to find a common denominator because none of y'all speak English, but you all speak different languages. So I actually, by junior high, I tested out of ESL because I was like, just leave me in class. I'll learn English eventually, but like getting taken out. I think if it would be with all Latinos, there'd be one thing because you're like, okay, cool. Like you're speaking to us in English and in Spanish, but because I went to school that was so diverse, which is beautiful, but it also presented a problem, which was we speak 7 different languages, 10 different languages in this class. How are we all going to communicate? And it just made the teacher talk to us like we were really slow. And it was like, oh, hello. And it was like, okay, like really, like we all kind of looked at each other like,
not again. And in Argentina, did you learned no English whatsoever, or were you relatively familiar? Because I feel like in Tijuana, like it's a border city, right? So I did take English classes, and coming here was just slightly, but not fully familiar. But I understood that it was another language, you know? And I feel like sometimes when you're probably in other countries, that thing in your brain of like, there's 2 languages and you can communicate in this other language is different. So what was your experience?
So I grew up with my grandparents in a place called Mar del Plata. I moved to Buenos Aires to live with my mom for 2nd grade. In 2nd grade, I went to all Spanish school, and then she put me in an English school. So I'd go for like an hour, 2 hours in the afternoon to an English speaking school, but we're learning like pencil, book, pig. Like I knew like some words, but not enough to like when I came here, I was just like, and people were talking really fast. So I was just like clueless when I first moved here. I was just like, it was very much a culture shock of like, where am I? What are they speaking? I don't understand. I don't know how to communicate in a way that people understand me. So it definitely took some adjustment, both on a language and just on a cultural level, just like dress different, ate different things. Like I remember the first day we got here, my mom had lived in the U.S. before. So she took me to like a corner store, and she bought me Doritos and a root beer because we had nothing like Doritos and a root beer in Argentina. And she was like, you should try this. This is what I remember from living here. And I was just like, what is this? Like it tasted so foreign. Like everything felt very foreign at that time. Yeah. And it probably took like 2 or 3 years of like trying to figure out, okay, how do I belong here? And even then, when I was able to speak English, I think the identity part was also like, now I was starting to dress a little bit more here. And when I was going back to Argentina at Christmas, my cousins would be like, oh, he's becoming a gringo. But when I would come back from Christmas, they were like, oh, that's the kid who's coming back from Argentina. Like, it's like, I was neither here nor there. I was like, neither aquí, neither allá. I had like a foot in both worlds. But
can you name specific things of what was different in terms of like, maybe like the way that you dressed?
Yeah, like I was actually looking at pictures from that, and it's like I started to wear like, I had like a Miami Dolphins like sweat whatever, and it was like I started to wear baggy pants and like baseball hats and like things that in Argentina they were not wearing at the time. Maybe now they are, but back then, like I was coming back and they're like, you don't look like you're from here anymore, and like so that kind of created, and then back then, like people had like the stereotypes of whatever California was like. They're like, do you surf to school? And I'm like, did you just ask me if I surf to school? Like you think there's like a wave that takes me like from my house? But you know, they watch whatever they watched back there, and Baywatch or something, whatever was a series that was playing back there. And in their head, they think that like that's the life that I was living, which is funny because to them, I think they kind of like glamorize this idea that I lived in the U.S., but they all lived in houses, and I lived in a small house apartment with my mom. So I was like, y'all are living a way better life back then than I was. Like my mom and I were living in like married student housing that was like part of the UC system. So like we lived in a small little apartment. Yes, when I look back on it, now I have more opportunities. But back then I was like, y'all are making it seem like because I'm in the U.S., I must be rich or something. And I'm like, y'all got houses and backyards, and like we don't have that. Like we live in a small little apartment. So
it's so interesting. I'm sorry. It's so interesting because what you're talking about is things that I'm seeing with my little sister right now in terms of like literally clothing back in Tijuana. And even though it's so close, but it's just such a present thing. Right now she's obsessed with sneakers, and it is crazy to me to see her because I'm like, oh my gosh, it's it's because it's a different culture. It's LA specifically has also a very specific culture.
Yep.
And then she has a friend who's from Colombia who just arrived, and she's also in ESL classes. And she was telling us about junk food. She's like, over there, we like never ate junk food, but here it's just so like accessible, and not I don't know if she meant financially, but just accessible that people just eat it whenever. It's part of people's lives. And she's like, in Colombia, like that never happened with my mom. Like we don't eat that sort of stuff.
Yep.
It's like, oh my gosh, it's so interesting, because I feel like sometimes we think that immigration maybe happened years ago, but it's also such a present thing still for new people that are coming into the country.
For sure. It's funny you said the food thing, because my grandmother would come visit every once in a while, and she couldn't believe that people would eat while they're walking on the street. Like, because we live by UC Berkeley, so like a lot of students would be eating their food as they're walking to class and stuff. She's like, what's wrong with people? Don't they sit down and have lunch or dinner? Like, why are they eating while they're walking? Like, she couldn't understand like the cultural difference of like, for us, it was like, you sit down, you eat with your family, you eat for like an hour and a half, everyone talks. And like here, everyone's just like eating food as they're like walking. And she was like, this is so strange. Like,
No, it is interesting. I still do eat with my family when I can for like an hour and a half, because we are a family of talkers. And I do think that it's a cultural thing, but also it's a like my family. We like to eat and talk. But I'm wondering, okay, so here you said you came here and then you just became fascinated with hip hop. And I'm like going back to Argentina. What was your relationship to music? You mentioned your mom was a journalist, but I know that she was not the same type of journalist that you are in terms of like entertainment and music.
Yeah,
and that
my mom
stuff.
was always into books. Like she's a heavy reader. My relationship to music, I think one of my first memories was when I lived in my grandparents' house. I was going through, there was a room that had some of her stuff from when she used to live in Europe, because my mom used to work at the BBC. And I found like some cassettes there, and it was like The Police and like a couple other. The Police is the one that I remember, and I remember like putting it and like trying. Obviously, I didn't speak any English, but it was like trying to understand like what it was. And then my uncle would always play music when I was at his house, and I remember my grandmother like sweeping the living room and listening to tango and dancing with a broom. So I think those are like some of like my early memories. My mom's not really a big music person, so I think once we moved to the U.S., she was working, she was going to school. And I was listening to the radio all the time and like trying to understand what the kids at school were listening to. But it was very like, in Argentina, it was a lot more like rock en español, maybe some pop, but there was definitely no hip hop at the time. So when I came here, I went to Malcolm X Elementary School. Like hip hop was what kids were listening to on the playground. So it became very much like, okay, what is this? How can I relate to this?
Did you see, maybe through movies or through some type of visual content, hip hop in television? And I asked this because I remember like in Tijuana, before I came to the United States, I would watch, I was fascinated with the way that African Americans dressed and the way that like culturally what I was seeing on television. So coming here, I remember that I wanted to, I literally had told my family like, oh my gosh, I want to be, and I don't know if this may be problematic, maybe, but I was like, I want to be a chola. Like I want to go to the United States, and that's how I want to dress. That's how I want to exist in the United States. And it was interesting because it was what I was seeing, but to me it was so cool, even though that's like a Chicano identity, but I was like, oh my gosh. But because I was seeing it through television, did you see hip hop in television before?
No, I think back then, like the music videos that were playing in Argentina were more like pop. It was like Michael Jackson and Madonna, and like it was like super pop. Like back then, like hip hop was not getting played in Argentina. I think the closest thing that I remember ever seeing in Argentina was like El General, like Boom Boom or like stuff like that. But yeah, back then, like hip hop wasn't really making its way. It wasn't mainstream enough to make its way, because I moved in like 87, 88. So the few things that were like making it there were like pop music was making it. So I think my experience with hip hop was living it. It was like going to school at Malcolm X and like seeing it in front of me, and like It wasn't really through television because we weren't getting that in Argentina.
And here, how did you start living it? Because I heard conversations that you said that the hip hop culture, you started living the hip hop culture.
Yeah.
What does that mean for someone who may not know what that was?
I mean, hip hop is what we did on the playground. Like hip hop was like how we communicated with each other. Hip hop is how we dressed, how we acted, how we danced. Like it was just what we lived every day. Like I don't know how to explain how someone lives something. It's just like it's all around you. It's like everywhere we went, whether it was like a cipher in school or whether it was like a party at night. It was just like that's what we were doing. Like we weren't really thinking about, oh, we're doing hip hop. It was just more like that was how we communicated in school. So yeah, I don't know how to explain how to live it. It's like I went to school, we were there in the playground, dancing, b-boying, doing whatever. It was just like, it was just what you did.
Okay, and I'm wondering with your mom being a journalist, and you going into that route, how did she influence your interest for pursuing also that career in the beginning of your career?
It's interesting because when I was in high school, I wanted to be a sports broadcaster. And it wasn't until I got disconnected from her student visa when I was 18 and I became undocumented that that started to shift, because I think my time while I was undocumented really showed me a lot of the struggles in our community. And as an apprentice for a radio station called KPFA in the Bay Area, I went through an apprenticeship program there for women and minorities. And that was really about teaching us the radio basics, but it also was teaching us about the power of our voice. And I remember we had like a workshop about like finding your voice. And at that time I was deportable and like just a lot of stuff was going on in my life. And I was really quiet during that workshop. And after the teacher came to me and she was like, hey, like, I know you're going through a lot. I realized you didn't really participate in the workshop. And I was like, yeah. And she was like, I know what you're going through, but she's like, you also have to understand that you have a microphone in front of you. So when you're quiet, you're not just quiet for yourself, but you're quiet for all the community who's going through what you're going through. And a lot of people who are undocumented don't have a chance to have a microphone in front of them. So I think that was really a turning point for me, because it was, oh wow, when I'm being quiet about my story, I was just like, I'm just being quiet about my story. But it was like, oh shit, I'm being quiet for everyone that's going through this too. Like the people who are bus boys with me, the people who are working at a factory stuffing envelopes, like the people who INS, now is Homeland Security, would degrade when they would ask for their forms with an accent. And people would be like, if you want to live in the US, you have to learn our language. Like I was around all of that, and I was realizing how a lot of people from our community didn't have a voice to express what they were going through. And I think at that point, my track went from like wanting to be a sports broadcaster to being like, no, I want to do something more in line with what I'm experiencing and providing a voice. And while I was at the radio station, I started a cable access show at Berkeley TV. And it was interviewing artists in the Bay Area, like living legends and hieroglyphics and the coup. And we were talking about using hip hop as a tool for social change. And I think that's when kind of like my mom's background in journalism and the type of hip hop that really fed me, which was more on the like conscious lyrical hip hop, kind of merged. And I was like, okay, I'm going to use hip hop as a means to talk about social injustices and talk about things that matter to me. And I think that's kind of like where my mom's experience and my experience kind of like merged into the path that I've been on ever since.
I think you did that perfectly with with your show De La Calle, but I want to ask you, did you know that you were going to become undocumented at that age?
It's weird because at that time there was no internet. So I knew that we came here on a student visa and that at some point something was going to happen. I didn't know what was going to happen. And my mom, and I would get kind of depressed when I would think about it. I was like, because I went from public school to then I was getting in a little bit of trouble. So my mom put me in private school. So I went to the college preparatory school where everyone there graduates and goes to a good school. And I was coming from public school. So I was like behind in math, science, English, like everything. Because everybody from that school had been in a private school most of their life. So I was like playing 3 sports, having tutors, doing everything to become a perfect college applicant. And then it got all taken away from me. Like I got accepted to Occidental, which is down here in LA. And then I got a letter from them saying, you're undocumented. Back then it was illegal. You're an illegal alien. You can't come to the school. And then like 2 weeks later, I get a letter from the government saying like, you're in deportation status. And I was like, yo, I spent the last 10 years trying to build something here and now I'm getting kicked out. So it was, it was definitely a moment of depression and adjustment and trying to figure out like what exactly was going on. But at the same time, after going through depression, it kind of like gave me that, hey, I might only be here for a day. I'm going to maximize that day. I'm going to go intern at this radio station. I'm going to go work at this cable access TV show. I'm going to make the most out of every day. Looking back on it, it made me who I am. At that moment, I was like, this isn't fair. Like, why is this going on? Like, I want to go to college like everyone else. Like, I worked hard to get into college. I want to. So it was, it all happened the way it was supposed to happen. But back then, I couldn't understand it. I was like, this isn't fair.
Yeah, and okay, so you pursued a career like through broadcasting and existing within these spaces. I'm wondering, did you ever intend to make hip hop, hip hop music specifically?
I always loved the culture. I never saw myself as like a rapper or like I DJ'd, and I think that was my contribution. But I think I was always more of like, I wanted to protect the culture and empower people that I believed in and kind of like be a vehicle for them more so than ever being like, oh, I want to rap or I want to break dance or I want to do whatever. So I think that was always, I was interested in like storytelling and also I think being a first generation Latino and like turning on the TV and not seeing a lot of shows talk about us. It was like every once in a while I would get like a Mi Familia or Selena or La Bamba, but it would be like every like 4 years I would get something that I could watch with my mom and talk about. So I was like, I want to create content that talks about our community and that our community can resonate with. And that was kind of the path that I started to go in.
And then at what moment did you decide to create Hard Knock TV?
So I graduated from film school. I graduated with a film major at Oxy. I was working at Sony Music at the time. I had 5 jobs through college. I was working at Sony Music. I was the music director at the radio station. I had my record label. I was working street teams. I worked at the library, and I was a production assistant on a film set.
And I have to ask, how did you get all of these jobs? Because I think it's always like so daunting to think about getting a job in the industry, specifically the entertainment industry. So how did those happen?
Well, I had to pay my way through college, so I had to work as something. And I think first it was working at the college radio station. Through that, I started making relationships with the record labels because I reported to a magazine called CMJ, which is the College Music Journal. And a lot of record labels wanted to get their artists on there. So they would send us music and I would listen to music. I would give it to the different shows and I would report. So then I remember talking to Sony and be like, oh, I want to play some artists, and they're like, we actually don't have a urban college rep. They had a rock college rep, but they didn't have an urban college rep. And I was like, hey, I would love to be that. So then like I kind of went from being the music director, but also working at Sony. And then while I did that, I started doing street teams, and through street teams, I started to see opportunities on how to like do that. And then I think through my college, I was able to get a job as a PA. And then I think because I was partly on financial aid, the school got me a job at the library. So I was just like, they're like, you need to pay for your whatever books here, go work at the library. So I was just like constantly hustling and taking summer school classes so I could not have as big of a load to take because I had to work all these different jobs.
Wait, and you mentioned you studied film.
I did.
Interesting. What got you into like growing a career in music journalism?
Well, I went to school to be a film major, but a lot of the jobs that I got were in music. And I think because during the 3 years when I was undocumented, I was working at a radio station, and also I had a cable access TV show, but interviewing music artists. And then I started the record label, and I had my record label while I was going to college. I always had one foot in both worlds.
Okay.
So it was like, I love music. I'm working in music. I'm also studying film so I can learn how to edit and use cameras. And my senior thesis was a documentary about the decline of the music industry, because that's when Napster and LimeWire and all that happened. So I always was straddling both worlds of like, I love music. Music, as the only child of a single mom, like music was the thing that like kept me going and like helped me through the ups and the downs. So that was always like what I woke up to every day. And then I always knew I needed some skills on the TV and film side to be able to like merge them together, because I knew I wasn't going to be a rapper or an artist. So I was like, well, if I'm not that, then I got to be a storyteller.
Mm-hmm. And you have built a career about being a storyteller, which is amazing. And I would love to talk more about your show, but we're going to be going on a small commercial. So we'll be back to talk about that.
Is this a commercial?
This is a commercial break. If you're a business owner and would like to promote your brand with our community, hit us up on our email at laartisteadapodcast@gmail.com. And thank you all for listening. Make sure to subscribe and connect with us on social media. We would always love to hear from you. Now, back to the chit chat. Okay, we're back from our little commercial. Okay, so you had to answer the other question of how did you build Hard Knock TV?
I built Hard Knock TV because before that I had Hard Knock Records. And I had two artists on Hard Knock Records that were both conscious rappers. And what
does that mean?
I think to me, conscious rappers means that it was artists who were talking about different issues in our community. And I think that type of hip hop is not the type of hip hop that gets played on commercial radio stations. And there's less outlets for that type of hip hop. So being on the record label side of that, like reaching out to magazines and trying to get them to cover the artists that I was working, a lot of them were like, nah, we don't really cover that type of hip hop. Or they would be like, you have to pay to have an ad in our magazine in order for us to do a review of your artist.
That's so interesting. I need to like make a little pause because I feel like it's so interesting because of the origins of hip hop and how it started as a political thing, but now we're going through that.
Well, because I think we live in a capitalistic society, right? So I think whether you're talking about music or you're talking about TV and film, when art becomes a commodity, I think, and when people start making money off it, I think that sometimes you lose some of those elements. You know, it's like, if we think about cooking, it's like a home cooked meal, and then you get McDonald's and fast food, and then you stop getting the nutrients. And I feel like that's what was happening in hip hop. It's like, as the big labels were coming in and money was being made in hip hop, sometimes those nutrients that I grew up with, like somebody who didn't have a father, whose mom was working, like hip hop meant something to me. Those lyrics meant something to me. Those lyrics helped me get through depression. Those lyrics helped me when I was getting bullied. Those lyrics helped me through different things. So it was important for me to support that type of hip hop. And when I was on the record label side of it, I realized that there weren't a lot of outlets that were actually supporting the type of artists that I liked. So the record label didn't work out, unfortunately, because the music industry was starting to decline, and I was funding it with credit cards. And at some point, they stopped letting me put stuff on credit cards, and I was like, "Oh shit, I got a bunch of debt, and I don't know how to get out of it." But I think through that experience, I realized, okay, I want to create a platform that artists that have something to say can say that, because at the time all the like radio interviews were focused on like beef and drama and gossip and like different things that I was like, that's not the part of hip hop that feeds me. I want to create something so that the artists that I like have a platform to speak about the lyrics, to speak about substance, to speak about vulnerability, to speak about these things that back then nobody was really talking about. So I was like, having been a film major, I tried to go to Hollywood and create a TV show that would do that. And everyone's like, nah, we're not interested in that. If you want to have a hip hop show, it's got to have models and cars and all this different stuff. And I was like, I'm not trying to do that. Like, I'm trying to have like why is there a Bill Maher or there's a whatever that can have in-depth conversations, but we can't have that in hip hop? I was like, I want to create that. And from them all telling me no, there's this thing called YouTube that would have like cats and dog videos. And back in 2005, and I was like, okay, I'm going to go create something there and then come back to Hollywood when I have built something that I can show them, hey, there's an audience here.
Did you, okay, this is interesting because I'm like, you had a vision of how you were going to grow that. Did you know that you were the first hip hop channel on YouTube?
No. I think it was, I went to YouTube because it's the only place that didn't tell me no. Like, I didn't go to YouTube because I was like, YouTube's going to become the biggest platform. I'd like to take credit for that, but that wasn't it. It was kind of like, okay, like we can do interviews, we can post it here. Nobody can tell me no. So I can go build it. And at the time, there wasn't any advertisement on YouTube because 2005, 2006, 2007, there was no like pre-roll videos. There was no advertisements on the side. Like the internet hadn't caught up to that yet. So it was really just creating content to build a fan base and then having to go find other ways to pay my bills. And I was blessed that an executive at MySpace who passed away last year, rest in peace, Roslyn, but she saw my content on the YouTube channel. She was like, I want you to create what you're doing for Hard Knock. I want you to do this for MySpace and I'll pay you for that. And you can keep building Hard Knock. And she was a blessing and an angel in the biggest way because I was in huge credit card debt. I was about to leave the music industry and go be a banker or something stable because I was like, I can't even afford my rent right now. And
you know what's interesting to me that I feel like right now, just with this podcast, right, in terms of interviewing people and how do you build something along with other people, and you did that. And I remember in another interview you mentioned that you were reaching out to artists who hadn't popped off but then did pop off. And I'm just thinking, how did it make you feel to see that those people were probably going to pop off and have those conversations through the beginning and building those relationships initially?
I think because coming up through all this, I always had my foot in the music industry. I always had an idea of the type of artist that I wanted to succeed in the music industry. And I was like, if you're thinking early 2000s, it was very much like the bling bling area. And you might be too young for this, but it was very much like the bling bling era. It was very like Cash Money Records, like 50, like it was very much like hyper masculine and very much about like who's got the biggest chain, the biggest car. And I was like, there's the next generation, I think, is going to have something to say outside of this. And I think I started looking around and seeing somebody like a K Dot, like his first mixtape, and I was like, I like what he has to say. And hearing J. Cole's first album, like I like what he has to say. And meeting Nipsey Hussle and be like, his mindset is different. Like, and I think, you know, same with Wiz Khalifa, same with Mac Miller. It was just, I was like, there's a new wave that is going to be the next wave after what's going on right now. And I was lucky enough to be in a space of launching a YouTube channel and creating a platform when they were coming up, and then being one of the first to sit down with a lot of these artists and have in-depth conversations, and then growing the platform from that, because at that time it was the blog era, and none of the blogs had video content yet. So they would take my interviews and put it on their blogs.
Oh, wow.
And that's how Hard Knock as a brand was able to grow, because my interviews would get picked up everywhere. And that's then music labels would see that and say, oh, we want to do an interview with you, because when we do an interview with you, it pops up everywhere. And that's how it was, like brick by brick, we were kind of able to build something that meant something to people, because it was from one interview to the next interview. I didn't have this vision of like, 10 years from now, I was just like, okay, I know I want to build a brand that stands for something that allows artists to have a space to talk about different things. And I just bet on artists that I believed in. And luckily, a lot of those artists ended up becoming the next generation superstars. And from that, I was kind of able to build a brand.
Yeah, that's so cool because I feel like with the previous iteration of my podcast, when I was doing Zoom interviews, I remember that one friend told me, "Yeah, it's because what the conversations that you're having, these are artists, and they were not music artists. It was models, influencers,
Yep.
or photographers." And he was like, "You're building an archive for how these people are coming up."
Yep.
And that's just so valuable. Like, yeah, it may not have thousands and thousands of followers, but it's an archive. And right now I see those, literally all these people that I interviewed, that I'm like, oh my gosh, we can go back to those conversations of how you were hustling and
Yep.
talking about that hustle of how do you find new opportunities when, showcasing your art when maybe you don't have that much access to people who may promote it. And then talking about how they were doing it, I'm like, oh, what a beautiful moment that.
And I think it speaks to the type of interviews that you do, which I think are similar in that I was always looking for evergreen content. I was looking for like what makes somebody who they are, where a lot of, I think, interviews at the time were looking very much for like the clickbait headline of like, oh, who's got beef, who's got tabloid gossip, who's got whatever. And those maybe get you a big hit at the moment. But I always bet on the long term where it's like, oh, I'm going to give you who Kendrick Lamar is before he put out his first major album. And it's like, people will always want to go back and see who he was at that time, where whoever might interview him afterwards might talk about whatever, drama or beef or, I mean, currently that's going on right now. So it's just like, I think it's also from what you're building important to kind of like get to the core of what someone is, because I think that people will always be interested in going back and seeing that interview. Whereas like, I think some of the interviews that I see today are kind of disposable because they're not really going in depth. They're going more for like whatever the headline at the moment is.
Yeah, and it's just very powerful. And I want to talk about your show specifically. You also have I feel like you have a great mix of people who have popped off, but also of up and coming artists. And they take you literally on the streets where they started. They talk about how that space, like literally that physical space, influenced their careers. How did you feel about just becoming so up close and personal with people's artistic journeys?
Are we talking about De La Calle or
De La
Hard Knock
Calle, I'm
TV?
sorry, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Moving on to the most recent one.
Well, because I did that with Hard Knock TV too. So it's like I've always been very much interested in showing the communities and the stories behind the songs and the music. So when I created De La Calle, for me, I had a few different things that I wanted to do. One was take the stigma that every time I turned on the TV and I saw shows about our community, everything was a negative stereotype. And I was like, okay. I was like, I'm going to take this idea of the street, which is associated with a negative connotation, and I'm going to show you the humanity behind the street and the people who are there hustling, living every day, doing all kinds, being creative, making something out of nothing, because that's what hip hop was. Hip hop was created in New York from people who didn't have a lot of resources, pretty much just making their own reality. And I wanted to make that connection to how people were doing that in Latin America. So for me, it was important that that we told that story beyond the music, because I feel like right now Latin music's having a moment and people can sing along to some of the biggest hits, but it's like, but do you know the culture? Do you know the history? Do you know the difference between Puerto Rico and Mexico and Colombia? Like, I also wanted to use this show as a chance to study a little bit of the Latin diaspora, because I felt like a lot of people just kind of like lump everyone in a box, but don't understand that every country has its own relationship to the U.S., to each other, their own background, their own music. And I wanted to use the show as a conduit to have some of those conversations.
And there's this one specific moment that I thought it was very funny. I can't remember the name of the artist, but in Argentina, that he takes you to the 5 stairs, I think.
Los Quintos Calones.
Ajá,
Yep.
los Quintos Calones?
Sí.
And then he's like talking about how like people came together and did rap battles, and that this lady would complain, and then he was like, oh, but now she's part of history. And I was
They would throw water.
Yeah.
They would throw water on them because back then, like there was no hip hop industry in Argentina, so there was these 5 stoops in a park, and that's why it was called Quinto Escalones, because it was literally 5 steps. And they would start rapping there, and there was an apartment building right here. So when they started to gather a crowd and make noise, like the people who lived there were like, "Shut up! Like we're trying to sleep, like whatever." So they were telling me how like people would like throw buckets of water to get them to disperse. But that ended up becoming such a big scene that it ended up moving to a different part of the plaza. And then like a lot of the big artists, a lot of the big rappers from Argentina ended up coming from that. So it's kind of crazy to see how. You know, when I left Argentina, it was very much rock en español, and they weren't listening to any hip hop. And now coming back to Argentina, whatever, 25 years later, and now the youth is expressing themselves through cumbia 420 and hip hop and reggaeton and Latin trap. It's kind of like, oh wow, like I left, and now the thing that influenced me 20 years later is influencing a new generation. So that was kind of a trip to go back and go to Quinto Escalón and Parque Rivadavia.
Yeah, and there's also this other artist, which I should have memorized the names, but they are not coming back to my
There's
brain.
a lot of artists.
Yeah.
I'm not going to hold you accountable for
Thank
not
you,
memorizing.
thank you. But who speaks about something
What
that
episode? Do you remember?
Argentina,
Oh,
the Argentina one.
okay.
Yeah, I'm staying on the Argentina one for this moment.
Got it.
And he talks about how he's teaching classes to kids on the streets.
Yep.
To teach them how to rap. And he said something that I thought it was so interesting.
Inti is his
Inti?
name.
Oh, okay, yeah.
He was Trueno's mentor, or one of his mentors when he was young.
Yeah, and Trueno is a huge global Argentinian artist. Yeah, and he was talking about how usually these kids are told in school to be quiet. They come back home and like the parent situation sometimes not the best, and they're also told to be quiet. So he uses this school to teach them how to express and how to be able to deliver the message that they have. And I was like, that is just so fascinating, because I think sometimes when we think about kids being rebellious or like teenagers being rebellious, usually you don't think where that's coming from. And him using that as a platform to channel that, to help them learn how to channel what they want to talk about. I was like, oh my gosh, like that is what art is, but it's great to have someone who like teaches you how to do that. And the kids that were on the show, I was like, oh my gosh, like this song sounds so professional.
It's crazy because watching that in Argentina reminded me of the apprenticeship radio program that I was in, because they were getting us to channel all the different things that we were all going through. Myself, I was going through being undocumented. Somebody else was going through different things, to find our voice and use hip hop as a tool for social change. And then to go to Argentina and see that other people are also tapping into that element and are saying, hey, why are disenfranchised youth disenfranchised? Because a lot of the times they go to school and the things that they're learning, they don't feel applies to them. You know, so it's like, I think that it's important to reconnect to those elements of hip hop that I think were there at the beginning, that I think sometimes along the way, because it's become so commercial, we've lost some of the importance of what those elements mean to marginalized communities, and how important it is for communities who a lot of people are ignoring and pretending they're not part of our society because they come from humble beginnings. That hip hop is that thing. Hip hop, whether it's in Argentina or when we went to Oaxaca and Mexico, and Mare Advertencia Lírica is saying, I do hip hop because I needed to survive. And to me, like, that's the art form that I fell in love with, is when people needed it to survive. I think at some point people started thinking about, how do I make a song that's going to get me signed by a record label? And that's fine. I get it. No knocking people hustling to get a paycheck. But I think it's also important to remember, like, what is it that we're trying to express? And especially when we're talking about Black and brown communities, like, hip hop is a tool for social change, or it can be a tool for social change. And I think that sometimes that element has been removed from the culture. And it's beautiful to go through Latin America and see artists who are still finding ways, whether it's workshops with kids or whatever, to connect to what I consider the essence of hip hop.
And in the Puerto Rico episode, you interview Villano and Tillano, and also right now 2 artists that I really like. but that haven't popped off globally. And I thought it was very interesting, the conversation that you had with them, because right now talks about women's like issues within the industry, and then Villano Antillano talks about trans women's issues in the industry and why it's so important for her to be talking about this. And it's so interesting because I think with Villano Antillano, she talks about also having fun, like in her identity, and having fun in like living also as a woman, you know? And so I'm wondering, for you that you don't identify with these things, why was it important for you to bring this conversation into the show?
I actually do identify with those things. Growing up with a single mom, I feel like feminine energy is something that I was raised by my grandmother and my mom. So to me, I feel like hip hop's always been hyper masculine, and I've always tried to find like what is the other side of hip hop to bring a balance, because and especially in Puerto Rico, when we start talking about the future of hip hop, the future of reggaeton that started off as like hyper masculine, and a lot of times with lyrics that were degrading to women, that were violent towards women. It was important for us to find other avenues in which the art form can grow, because if we don't have space for women and for feminine energy in the platform, then the culture is never going to grow. So it was definitely something that in Puerto Rico and in everywhere that we went, it was like, okay, let's figure out like who are the artists, not just women, but like indigenous people, who are the Afro-Latinos, who are the within Latinos, which are already marginalized, who are the also more marginalized within our own community, voices that we're not hearing. It was very much something that was intentional with my producers and with everyone involved to make sure that we told those stories. But yeah, in Puerto Rico, you know, the first wave of reggaeton was, you know, maleantado, and like there was a lot of stuff that was very hardcore, and it was like, okay, well, where's the balance here? But it's interesting because Villano was like, but I have fun with that stuff too, you know, because I asked them like, you know, what's it like for you to be in a genre that a lot of times has, you know, homophobic and like violence towards women? Like, she's like, you know, she's like, I love hip hop. And she's like, sometimes I like some of those lyrics. She's like, I don't take it that seriously. But at the same time, it's important to talk about what is serious, which is there's a lot of violence towards women in Puerto Rico. And they talked about, you know, how it was important to use their platform to also talk about those subjects.
You know, it's interesting because I was reading a book about women empowerment within Brazilian funk, and they talk about the different types of like women empowerment within funk. Which one was political, one was sexual, and then another, and then there were like other two that I can't remember. But it's that I think, I don't know if dichotomy is the right word, but because people think like, oh, no, it's because this is degrading to women. Like, well, it's like this ownership, you know, of that type of music, which I think is fascinating with reggaeton, with hip hop, with funk, which I really like learning the history about. But I also want to talk about like identity, because you mentioned that it was important to you to bring light to the voices of like within Latinidad in the United States, the more marginalized or more underrepresented group. And I think that's so interesting because I really wanted to talk with you specifically about this, because I think that right now I'm going like through a process, and I've been going through this process for the entire year, but I'm like, I don't know if there's like an actual final answer. But very recently I started identifying as a white Latina, and I started identifying as a white Latina because even though when I interact with white Latinos tell me like, oh no, I don't see you as a white Latina. Black and like brown indigenous Latinos tell me I am a white Latina. And I'm like, well, I think this has something to say. And I actually agree, because I once was having a conversation with a friend years ago, and when I was in college, and he told me, I was like very ignorantly, I'm sorry, maybe with the best intentions, but very ignorantly, I said, oh, I want to be the voice of like indigenous people. And he was like, get it? Why do you want to do that? Like, they already have a voice. You don't need to be their voice. And so right now, as I grow my career in the entertainment industry, I'm like, I feel like I have to be super self-conscious of my identity to know when I can help and I can support, but also knowing that there are certain limits. And to me, that's important. So I'm wondering, how do you identify in general, and how does that play in your decision making?
Well, first of all, with De La Calle, I wasn't trying to be anyone's voice. I think we were very intentional through the series of providing a platform for people to tell their own stories. And I think that was something that from the very beginning, I rebelled a little bit against traditional travel shows where the host usually is kind of like the voice of God and we're seeing wherever they're going through their perspective. And I was like, I don't want to do that. Like, I want to make sure that wherever we go, the people, it's what they want to share with the world, not what I'm seeing and then sharing with the world. And I think that's a nuance that watching a lot of Anglo hosts travel the world to exotic locations and then report back to the world what their experience was in Africa or their experience was in Latin America or their experience was in Asia. Like, I was like, let's not do that. Like, let's make sure that everywhere that we're going to, we're providing a platform for artists to tell their story. And I think that's an important part of the identity part, because when we're dealing with marginalized communities, I think the greatest allies that we can be is to provide a platform, to provide a microphone, to provide video cameras for people to tell their own stories, instead of going into the communities and say, hey, I'm here to tell my story of what you're going through. And I think that's where, and I think people who've seen the series, I think, can appreciate that a little bit. They're like, you're a host and we see your story, but it's not like dominant in the narrative of what we're watching. Like, you're sprinkled in and you connect the dots to certain things, but it's not overpowering to a point of like, it's my perspective on where we're going of everything that we're seeing. So I think that's important. And I think that's, as a journalist, as a media outlet, I think it's like, what's the intention here? And I think for the first 10 years of Hard Knock, you didn't even see me. Like, the camera was always on the artist, and it was so much about telling the artist story and removing myself that then at some point that ended up becoming a challenge when I tried to get sponsorship or other things. Because they're like, we hear your voice, but we never see you. Like, why don't we ever see you? And I was like, well, because growing up, I always felt like the host always made it about them, and I wanted to make it about the artist. So I removed myself from that equation. And I think later on, it was like, okay, this makes it hard to continue to build the brand if people aren't even seeing me in the interviews. They don't even know I did the Kendrick interview, or that I did the Nipsey interview, or that I did the J. Cole interview, I did the whatever interview, because I removed myself completely from it. I think partly because of that identity piece, because of it's like, okay, well, hip hop is hip hop, and it's like, oh, I'm hip hop, but it's like, how are people going to judge me if they see me on camera? It was part of that, and it was also part of like, how am I going to be a camera, sound, light, whatever, if I'm in front of the camera? So I think there's different things to navigate there. In terms of what I identify in, people have said that you're a white passing Latino to me, and I understand why people would say that. I think that there is something to be said for understanding the nuances of lived experience that every person has. Like, for me, when people say I'm a white passing Latino, I understand that. There are some spaces that I can probably maneuver around in because I'm white passing that maybe somebody who's darker skinned would have a harder time navigating through those spaces. But at the same time, when people use that as like an umbrella for your lived experience, I think it takes away from, because people then use white privilege, and it's like, yeah, I have some white privilege, but you have citizenship privilege. I didn't have citizenship privilege. Like, when I came here, like, I was going through high school thinking I was going to get deported if I trespassed or whatever. Like, I think I think our lived experiences are a sum of a lot of different experiences, and I think that some people have gone so far here as to only viewing things as whatever shade your skin is, and thinking like, oh, well, you're this, so then you have lived a privileged life because you have white privilege. And it's like, yeah, white privilege under a system that oppresses people who are darker skinned is a privilege. We have to acknowledge that. But But I think it's also important to understand that there's other privileges. And let's also talk about those. What is a citizenship privilege? Like, what does that look like when you don't have to worry that at one point you're going to get deported? You know, it's like, I think there's different privileges. What's growing up with, you know, financially well off? What's growing up with two parents? Like, those are we calling those privileges too? Because I know what it's like to not grow up with a dad, and how I had to figure out what my identity was growing up with a single mom, and like to navigate that. So I think that it's important that as we have conversations about identity, we do it in a nuanced manner and not just kind of throw this umbrella of, well, there's only one type of privilege, and that's whatever skin color you're in, and then like that's the only thing we talk about. It's like, no, that is one, and we have to acknowledge that there's systemic racism in education, in police, in government. And then I think it's important to also realize that there's other privileges also in those spaces.
Yeah, and I completely agree, because I think that I've given this a lot of thought too. And in terms of like coming to a decision of like racially how I identify. And to me, it's like thinking about my experience living in Tijuana. I grew up in private schools, and that was a privilege, because growing up in Tijuana, I never thought about being like darker skin. I guess within my family context, yes, because I am the darkest one, but within my social context, I never thought about that. And also education-wise, I came to the United States, and I was seeing the inequality in education, that like my teachers had no expectations for me, because I went to schools where there were very high expectations for me. And I see, you know, I don't know, there's no statistic about this. So this is a very personal observation. Thank you. Like in the entertainment industry, executives, Latino executives tend to be immigrants who were well off in other countries and are like Latino executives who are in those positions tend to be people who were better off. Tend to be, not everyone, obviously, but I'm like, and then we talk about Latinidad and about oppression in well, I'm not seeing myself represented. And I'm like, well, there is like these things that I feel are important for us to recognize, for us to be able to make sure that there is diversity within our groups, and maybe not only racial diversity, diversity also. Like in abilities, diversity in abilities, or different types of like sexual gender diversity. But I agree. But I think specifically with the racial diversity, racial identity, I'm like, it's something that I'm trying to make sense of, because I feel like that's one of the things that is most talked about, and it's most talked about as one. You know, like they're like as Latinos being a monolith, and I think that within the community, we sometimes don't really talk about the diversity within. So that's why I was like, how did you go about it?
Yeah, and I think diversity within and us being a monolith is a spectrum of conversation too, because I don't think it's just race. I think when the elections come up and people start asking, how come Latinos are voting this way or that way? And it's like, well, are you talking about the history in Cuba is different to the history in Mexico, which is different to the history in Puerto Rico? It's like, I think there's a lot of nuances when you're examining a diaspora of people who come from a lot of different countries. So I think race is part of that, but I don't think it's the only part. And I think that a lot of times, depending on what coast you're in, if you're in the middle of the country, it's like, oh, Latino experience in LA is centered around Mexicans and Salvadorians, and like certain things. Then you go to New York and it's centered around Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. And then you go to Miami and it's centered around like, so I think there's a lot of conversations to be had. And what I wanted to do with De La Calle is provide some entry points into those conversations, that I was like, I'm going to use music to start having some of these conversations, not to end the conversations, but to be like, oh, I'm going to provide a platform for artists that I believe have something to contribute to this conversation, to express that. And then hopefully people can use things that they saw in the episodes to be like, oh, I'm going to go talk to my friends or my family or whoever about this thing that I saw.
And I genuinely think I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I think you were very intentional in your decision making, and I think that's like pretty powerful. And then I also wanted to mention that I on one of the episodes you talk, I think it was a Puerto Rico episode, you talk about enslaved Africans and use specifically that word, and I wanted to ask you, like, if there were conversations about it, because I'm pretty sure as a journalist you understand the power of words, the power of linguistics, and I thought that was pretty radical, which I think I support, obviously, but wanted to see like if there were any conversations behind that.
Of course, there are a lot of conversations about everything that we do, because I brought in people that I thought represented a lot of different points of views, and it was important for us to have those conversations. And I think when you talk about slavery and when you talk about, you know, it's a condition. So it's like somebody's not a slave, they were enslaved. So I think it was important for us to be intentional about what words to use so that we can bring an elevation to the conversation that we're having. Because I think that, you know, some people start to tune out and they're like, oh, this is too progressive because you're referring to Latina or Latinx instead of, oh, don't say, you have to say Latino or Latina because if not, you're changing our language. And like, there's a lot of different conversations, and I'm all for identify however you want to identify. Like if you want to identify as Latino, great. If you want to identify as Latinx, great. If you want to identify as Hispanic, great. If you want to identify, like, I think there's bigger conversations to be had outside of that. So for us, yeah, we had those conversations internally of like, what was the voice that we wanted as a show, and being very intentional about like, how can we present a way to have this conversation that is thoughtful of different communities that have been marginalized. And some people might recognize that. Some people might go over their heads. Some people might be like, why are they choosing to say this instead of this? It's like, you know, I think it's what our team felt comfortable with, especially when we're talking about, you know, a lot of music and a lot of culture that has come from Afro-Latino background. It was important to make sure that when we're talking about certain things, that we're thoughtful about the way that we're communicating that.
Yeah, and I think it was pretty powerful. I noticed at least.
Thank you.
And okay, so we're now coming to the end, and I would love to know, I guess I have like a general idea of what this answer is, but what is the message that you want to put out to the world at the end of all of the work that you've done so far?
I don't know if there's one message. I think every project hopefully has multiple messages that allow people to pick and choose what they resonate with. I think overall, as someone who growing up didn't get a chance to turn on the TV and see a lot of things that I resonated with or that talked about my lived experience at the time, I think I'm trying to create more programs that allow for those conversations to happen, so the next generation can hopefully relate to something that they're seeing and feel identified, and, you know, hopefully be entertained and learn. And, you know, I think that's the blend that we were really focused on with De La Calle, of like history, culture, entertainment, identity, like finding a way to like straddle all those conversations. And I think moving forward, like the types of shows that I'm interested in will always kind of like straddle, you know, the intersections of all those things, because ultimately, like, I don't feel like we have enough of that content. And maybe I hope that in 5 years I turn on streaming and I'm like, man, there's a lot of content that talks about this, and then I'll go make some other content. But until I see that, you know, I think I'm just going to keep creating the type of content and providing a platform to share stories of people that I think oftentimes get overlooked and are marginalized. And that's the content that I always have gravitated to. So yeah, I think that's the content that I want to continue making.
And what is next for you? How can people continue to support you?
Next, I have unscripted shows that I'm taking out. I have scripted shows that I'm taking out. People can always follow on social media, Nicholas R. Barili. But they can engage, they can watch De La Calle, watch Scene, watch Hard Knock, share it with your friends, comment, hit me up if you like something, if you don't like something. It's a conversation. So I just want people to engage with it in whatever way feels authentic to them.
Thank you. I do have to say it was pretty daunting, again, as I said in the beginning, to interview the master interviewer, but I feel pretty confident right now that we finished.
You did a great job.
But yeah, thank you so much for being in our first episode of season 2 of La Artisteada. We are truly, I really hope that everyone who's listening leaves as inspired as I am after this conversation. You know, I think we covered a lot of topics that are deeply important in the world, but also very important to me. So selfishly, I feel very happy about this conversation.
Important to me too. So it was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, see you on the next one. Thank you.